I think that one of the biggest lies we tell ourselves in our 20s is that life moves in one direction, right? So you graduate, you get the job, you move out, you find your partner, and then you just start building your life. We often imagine our 20s and our early 30s like a staircase. But at this point, I've now spoken with 9 guests whose life plans did not go according to plan. And these conversations have really taught me that real life is more like a mountain. Sometimes you spend months climbing up just to realize that the trail goes back down before it goes back up again. And these down moments are really difficult because it feels like you're regressing. So, welcome back, my fellow planners, to another episode of the 5 Year Plan. My name is Anna. I'm your host. We're here to talk about all the life plans that do not go according to plan. And the topic of today's discussion is, I think, a question that a lot of us have, which is, am I falling behind? We are going to talk about where this feeling of falling behind comes from, why that we as high achievers have it double as bad, and how we can make this feeling of falling behind a little bit more palatable. Just one small thing before we start. Some of you may not know this, but this show is completely independent and bootstrapped, meaning that I research, edit, finance, produce all the episodes myself. So if these conversations have made your Sunday scaries or your daily commute just a little bit better, I would really appreciate if you subscribed and rated this podcast. It takes like 2 seconds, but it would mean the absolute world to me, and it would allow me to keep making these episodes for you. Okay, now on with the episode. So it's been almost 4 months of doing this podcast, and we're actually nearing the end of season 1. So we're going to have today's episode this week, obviously. And then next week, I have my episode coming out with Janine Ilya. For those of you who might not be familiar with the story, Janine fell into a coma in January of 2025, and she was in a week-long coma. And when she woke up, she had to basically relearn everything about her life. So she had to relearn how to, walk again and talk again the way that we all do so easily every single day. And most importantly, she had to relearn who she was and what she wanted out of life. And how do you go about life when you have a second chance? So anyway, that episode is amazing. Janine is incredible, and I'm so excited to share with you guys that episode. But that's going to be the last episode of season 1. In the meantime, we're going to be taking a bit of a break between now and season 2, but I've got some incredible guests lined up for season 2, some incredible stories, and I'm going to be trying a few, new things for season 2. So stay tuned for all of that. And again, I'm building this entire podcast in public. So if you want to see the creation of season 2 as it's going on before it launches, make sure you follow me on Instagram or on TikTok, because that's where I post all these videos of me trying to figure out this entire podcasting thing. So, and I should also say my handle is the 5 Year Plan Podcast for both Instagram and TikTok. So today's episode was actually inspired by a submission that I received from the Confessions Vault. And for those of you who may not know about the Confessions Vault or hearing it for the first time, I will link it in the episode below, but it's basically a place where you can share with me a story about you and what you're going through, and really anything that you want to just confess. The reason why I set up a vault like this in the first place is to share stories like the one I'm about to share with you onto this podcast. But sometimes it could also inspire the entire episode itself, which is what happened today. So let me read to you the submission that I received. And the submitter wanted to remain anonymous in the sense that they did not want me to reveal any identifiers. So I'm going to respect that. And for the purposes of this episode, I'm just going to refer to this submitter as Sarah. Okay? Okay, so here's Sarah's story. Hi, Anna. I recently discovered your podcast and I'm absolutely addicted. Aw. I'm in my mid 20s and I have suddenly felt very lost in life. For a bit of context, I studied a STEM degree and always had a clear plan of what I wanted to do after. I was a star student and perfectionist growing up, so I'm sure you can see where this is going. My entire degree was hindered by COVID, and I graduated in a post COVID job market. I moved back with my parents, which made me feel behind compared to my peers. But after God knows how many job applications, I miraculously found a job, but also in a very different sector. I gave it a go and I started to actually enjoy it. My team was mostly remote at the time, so a year into the role, I also moved to a new city and lived with my boyfriend. I felt like my life was progressing. But fast forward 2 years and everything's changed. Management shifted and my workload increased drastically, and so did the number of days in the office. So I am now back here feeling extremely burnt out and unsupported with a 2 hour commute where I spend 2 days a week back at home with my parents because they live close to my office. I feel extremely lost and like I regressed, and also like I'm losing time in my week to work on myself. I've applied for over 100 jobs in my new city, but have gotten nowhere. And as if I didn't have enough to handle, I decided to try something new and start a home baking business. I love this new experience and challenge, but I feel even more burnt out. I don't know how to continue working full time here, but I'm too anxious and not financially stable enough to quit. Sorry, this is so long. Oh, there is so much to say about this story. So, for those of you who have been following this podcast for a while, you know that I normally don't read my confessions at the very beginning of the episode. But the reason why I thought that it was necessary to do it in this case is because this listener described something that I think a lot of us have either gone through or maybe are currently going through, which is this feeling that we're regressing. Something in our life has happened that probably was out of our control. And as a result, that had consequences on us, which changed the trajectory of where we thought our life was going. And that feeling can feel really, really difficult to deal with, especially for high achievers. So, the first thing that I want to talk about is, where does this feeling of falling behind even come from? First of all, I think the feeling of feeling behind isn't actually about achievement, but it's actually about orientation. And what I mean by that is that as children, we grow up in environments where progress is synchronized. Everybody starts kindergarten at the same time. Everyone moves into grade one at the same time. Everyone graduates high school at the same time. University is a 4 year program. And then along the way, there are report cards, there are graduations, there's parent teacher interviews. And so for the first 20 ish years of our lives, progress has a clock. And it's a shared clock where everybody is doing the same thing at the same time for the same amount of time. I think because of that, we either subconsciously or consciously learn that progress means moving with everyone else. Like, think about when you were in school. You never wanted to be the kid who was held back at recess because they had to finish an assignment because everybody else was going out to play at recess. Or you never wanted to be the kid who had to take summer classes because nobody else had to do that. In fact, I remember in high school, I had a friend who I'm still friends with. She's like one of the smartest people I know. Like she's absolutely brilliant, okay? But she failed grade 12 math. And none of us know why she failed or how it was that she failed, because again, she's really, really smart. Like, she did really, really well in school. I think to this day we still think the reason why she failed is because she filled out her scantron wrong, like the paper where you have to like bubble in your answers, like A, B, C, D, right? We all think that the only reason why she failed is because she like missed a number or something, and so then all of the dots like shifted down one layer, one level. But as a result of her failing math, she had to take it again. But even back then, it was interesting to see how that took a hit on her confidence because all of a sudden she believed that she was someone who wasn't good at math, or she was someone who was behind her peers, or like people who went into the exam with a lower mark than she did. She now had the assumption in her head that she was worse at math than these people. And that's the thing, right? Is that school conditions us to think that we have to be moving with the pack. And if we're not moving with the pack, it means that there's something wrong with us. But then adulthood arrives, and this shared clock is no longer there. It disappears. All of a sudden, people want different things. People prioritize different things. Some people go on and get a master's degree or another type of post-secondary degree. Other people want to get married right away and start having kids. There's no correct age where you're supposed to get married, or you're supposed to find your career, or you're supposed to buy a house, or you're supposed to have children. There's no age on that, and there's no timeline on that. But your brain never gets the memo. And so I think what happens is that despite knowing all of that, we're still constantly searching for a clock. Because in a way, that clock gave us a lot of comfort, right? It told us that what we were doing was right, and that what we were doing is what we were supposed to be doing. But the fact that that clock doesn't actually exist in real life is a really difficult thing to grapple with. And this is something, by the way, that I struggle with all the time. Like anybody who knows me, anybody who's had a conversation with me in the last, I don't know, 4 years, okay, can attest to this. I am not by any means somebody who has figured this part of my life out. Okay. This is something I struggle with constantly on a day-to-day basis. But part of my purpose for doing these solo episodes is to share the things that I've learned with you guys so that we can all sort of work and grow and think about these things together. But I think that when we don't have these definitive anchors in which we're supposed to achieve something, we are left with a ton of uncertainty. And the only way to get around that is by manufacturing these timelines and manufacturing what we're quote unquote supposed to be doing. And the way that we do that is we look at the people around us. How am I doing compared to everyone else? How am I doing compared to Stacy, who just got engaged and bought a house? But what I actually found kind of interesting as I was preparing for this episode and reading some articles and doing some research is that I learned that there's actually an evolutionary reason behind all of this. And that's because that your brain's primary job is to keep you safe. Right? And in our evolutionary past, being safe meant moving quite literally with a tribe. And so being out of sync with everybody else in your tribe or in your group literally meant death. Like it meant that you could potentially die. Okay. So then when your brain perceives that you're behind your peers, your body kicks into this fight or flight response. And obviously that's no longer the case in the sense that we don't travel in packs anymore. And, it's not the situation where if you wake up late and you're literally behind the rest of your crew that you're gonna die. That's obviously not the case anymore. But this sort of natural instinct that if your brain perceives that you're behind your peers, then your fight or flight response kicks in, that still exists. And from this article I read, that's where a lot of the anxiety we have about this feeling of falling behind comes from. The other thing that I think exacerbates these feelings of falling behind is social media. And yes, I mean, of course, there's, everybody knows that social media is like the highlight reel, right? It's highlighting all the great things and the great achievements. Like nobody's going to post about being anxious or having a shitty day. But the other sort of perspective of why social media is so harmful, it sort of adds fire to the fuel of feeling behind, is our brain evolved from childhood until recently by comparing ourselves to like 100 people, right? You would compare yourself to the other people in your grade. I mean, I guess it depends on what sort of school you went to. But for me, I think typically growing up, you were in a class of like 30 other students and there were usually 2 or 3 classes. So yeah, like between 60 and 90, like 100 people, right? Max. That's what you were comparing yourself to, a pool of 100 people. But now with social media, you are comparing yourself to a sea of infinite people, right? Hundreds of thousands and thousands and thousands of lives. And on this note, I also wanted to say that, like, before I started this podcast, I was off Instagram for 3 years. I deactivated my personal social media account and it was it was wonderful. Like my screen time went down. I felt so liberated. But 3 years ago, the Instagram algorithm was very, very different. And what I mean by that is that you could only see the posts and the stories of the people that you followed. And of course, I think 3 years ago, there was still like the For You page, right? But on the actual feed itself, like on your personal feed, when you're scrolling through Instagram or when you're clicking on stories, you would only see the stories and the posts of the people that you followed. So if you did not follow somebody, things about their lives didn't show up. But what I realized after not being on social media for 3 years and having gotten back onto social media for the purposes of this podcast in March of 2025, because that's when I started the podcast, what I realized is that that is no longer the case. The algorithm has changed because now I see the posts, and I don't think I see the stories, but I see the posts of people who I don't follow at all, but who Instagram thinks has something in common with me, or for whatever reason thinks that I will resonate with the content. And so it pushes it out to me. So what that looks like for me is, I'm sitting there on like a Saturday morning, enjoying my cup of coffee, scrolling through Instagram, and I'm just like being constantly bombarded with posts from other podcasters. And I think because my feed is so saturated with creator content or podcast content, it can feel really overwhelming really easily because you can't help but compare yourself, right? I can't help but to look at their feeds and their following base and look at what they're doing and thinking like, oh my God, I'm not doing enough. I'm not moving fast enough. I'm not growing enough. All of these things, right? But if I never saw that, if that never came across my feed, I probably wouldn't have these thoughts, or at the very least, I wouldn't be having these thoughts at the rate or the intensity at which I'm having them, because I would just be able to focus on what I'm doing. Nobody, not a single person that I know is running a podcast. But because now I'm getting constantly bombarded with podcast content, right? I often find myself thinking, there are so many podcasts out there. Like everybody has a podcast. Every single person in the world has a podcast. Why would anybody listen to mine? The reason why I bring this up though, is because even when we were conditioned growing up to compare ourselves to our peers and move with our peers and move on the same timeline and the same clock as them, it was limited. It was limited in number of peers. But now with social media, it is no longer limited. And when we're playing this comparison game in a world of infinite possibility, that I think gets really, really tough. It's almost impossible not to feel like you're falling behind because there will always be someone in the world who is doing more of X than what you're doing. If you're a lawyer, there will always be someone who has argued more cases than you. If you're running a hair salon, there's always going to be someone who has more customers than you. Like the cycle of comparison just doesn't stop. And so even if the reason why we compare ourselves to others and we have these feelings of falling behind, even if the reason comes from sort of the structure and the systems that we grew up in, it is exacerbated like infinite fold by the circumstances that we've placed ourselves in now. vis-a-vis social media. The second thing that I want to talk about is why high achievers like us have it double as bad. I know that many of the people listening to this podcast are high achievers. We are high achievers. We are ambitious people. We are people who are obsessed with the idea of doing it right and doing it well. And so I think because of these oh my gosh, why can't I say the word? Because of these intrinsic, there we go, qualities about ourselves, we are not only conditioned to measure ourselves against a yardstick, but sometimes we don't even care what the yardstick is. And sometimes we even do this by borrowing somebody else's goals. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. When I was in undergrad, I did my undergrad in business. And the big sort of hype when you're in undergrad in business school is to get into consulting, and in particular, to get into consulting at one of the big fours. And so for those who may not know who the big fours are, they are, my God, let's see if I can even name them. It's Deloitte, EY, PwC, and is it KPMG? Is that the fourth one? I actually don't know. But basically, the idea was that the top business students, or the ones that everyone looked up to, were the ones who could land a role at one of these consulting firms. And by the way, there's obviously, McKinsey and Accenture. Those were obviously regarded as very high as well. So I shouldn't say that it was just the big four. But this idea that you had to land a consulting job at a very good consulting firm was like the dream for a lot of business students. Okay. That was never the dream for me, because when I was an undergrad, my goal was law school, right? Like my focus when I was an undergrad was getting good marks, not to get a consulting job, but to get into law school. And so I didn't have the same goals as everybody else did. And the other thing about me at the time too was, I've talked about this before in the podcast, but like when I was an undergrad, I ran a piano studio. So I already had a job. Like insofar as getting a summer job was important for financial reasons to, pay off student debt or pay off tuition or buy textbooks or whatnot. Like I had that already because I was running my own piano business. But even though my goals did not line up to the goals of my peers, I still felt an immense amount of pressure to apply for these roles. And I did. I applied for these roles and I interviewed for these roles and I prepped for these roles, and I didn't even want them. I actually remember there was one particular summer where I think this was maybe the first or second summer of undergrad, but I decided that summer I was going to run a summer camp for piano students. So when I ran the summer camp, it was like for a week, and I can't even remember how much I charged at the time, but I think it was like $500 or something for the week or something like that. And then I had 10 students, so I was making like $5,000 per week. Now I didn't run it for the full summer, by the way. Like I can't even remember if I only did maybe two weeks of the summer or maybe 3 weeks. I can't remember off the top of my head anymore. But in 1 week's time, I was making more than what some of my friends made all summer. And yet, like, I remember feeling like I was so behind because I wasn't doing what everyone else was doing. And so that, was an example of me measuring myself by somebody else's yardstick. It was me borrowing the goals of somebody else in order to feel like I wasn't falling behind, even though they weren't my goals. They weren't the things that I wanted. The other reason why I think that high achievers have it double as bad is because when we feel like we're not progressing the way that our peers are, it's not just about progression, it's about identity. High achievers are people who spend their lives defining themselves through progress. You are somebody who moves forward, whatever that means to you. You are not somebody who, like Sarah mentions, for those of you who aren't watching, every time I say Sarah, I like to have my air quotes going because That's not this person's name. But it goes back to that one line that Sarah said, which is, I feel extremely lost and like I regressed. Because you're somebody who is so used to moving forward, any step back doesn't just feel like a step back. It feels like an entire hit on your identity and who you are and what you're capable of and how much you believe in yourself. High achievers are not used to setbacks, and it's not because we haven't experienced setbacks. I think it's because the type of setbacks we're used to experiencing are very easy to fix. When you think about school, all of us have done poorly on an exam or an assignment or something, but there's a very easy fix to that. The easy fix is that we just got to try harder next time. We just have to go to the teacher's office hours and figure out what it is that we need to improve for next time. There are always tangible things that we can do to make sure that we are not in that situation again. And it's not to say that that doesn't have applicability to life. Of course it does. This is one of the things that I want to achieve with this podcast, is to inspire people to carve out the life that they want and to empower people to believe that you have the power to do what you want to do. And there's nobody who's stopping you except for yourself, right? But there's also so much that now is out of our control. I mean, when I think about Sarah's story, right? COVID happening, the management of her company drastically restructuring. These are things that she could not have prevented. And so I think that in these circumstances where we lose a bit of control over the things that are happening in our lives and we feel like no matter what we do, we can't get it back, it's a huge hit on our identity. When it hits our identity and when we now feel like we're somebody who is behind, it makes the things that we can do to quote unquote catch up, it makes that process harder because we don't believe in ourselves anymore, or at least we don't believe in ourselves the way that we used to. So what are some things that we can do to get over this feeling of feeling behind? How do we deal with this feeling when we're feeling it? Well, first, I actually want to share some stats because I think a lot of us feel behind because we have this arbitrary timeline in our heads that by a certain age, we need to graduate. By a certain age, we need to have a family. By a certain age, we need to be married. We need to have a home. We need to figure out our careers. And the stats today do not support this arbitrary timeline that we have in our heads. And so let me just actually read some of these out for you. Okay, so in 2020, the average age of a person who was married was 34.8 or 35 years old. Okay, and this is in Canada, by the way. It comes from an organization called the Vanier Institute, which I didn't know about until I started researching for this episode. But according to the website, they apparently provide statistical portraits of families in Canada. So, this idea that we have to be married by the time we're 30, like it's just bull crap, okay? And honestly, this statistic doesn't really mean anything either, because who cares? Like, who cares if you're 40 years old and you're not married? Who gives a damn? But for what it's worth, there's a number to, revamp your timeline a little bit, okay? Here's another statistic. The average house owner in Toronto is in their 40s. And here's another one. Most people don't find their careers until the ages of 30 to 40. Mel Robbins actually has talked about this concept that every decade has its own lie. So what she says is that in our 20s, the lie is that everybody's got to have everything figured out. And the reality is that your 20s is supposed to be the years or the decade of possibilities and exploration. In your 30s, the lie is that that's the time that you need to be settling down. But in reality, your 30s are the years where you're clarifying in your life what actually matters to you and what you want the rest of your life to actually look like. And the lie of your 40s is that if you haven't made it by age 40, then it's too late. But the reality is that most people actually launch in their 40s. And to support that, I actually wanted to share with you guys some stories of famous people who you may not know about. But Shonda Rhimes okay, who everybody knows Shonda Rhimes. She's the creator behind Grey's Anatomy. Oh my God, what is that show with Kerry Washington? Oh my gosh, why am I forgetting it? Scandal. Okay. Grey's Anatomy, Scandal, all of these incredible shows. She was pitching TV pilots at 34, and Grey's Anatomy didn't launch until she was 36. Okay, so there's an example of somebody who was in between her 30s and her 40s before she found the thing that stuck. Ariana Huffington from the Huffington Post. She didn't launch the Huffington Post until she was 54. Martha Stewart. She launched her first company in the catering business at 35. Vera Wang. Although she worked in the fashion industry, she didn't actually start designing herself until the age of 40. Zarna Garg, who many of you guys know is, first of all, she's one of my dream guests to have on the pod, but she's also one of the biggest inspirations to me. She didn't start her comedy career until the age of 44. And that was after she had finished law school, became a lawyer, worked a few years as a lawyer, then was a stay-at-home mom, then tried 18 different businesses, all of which failed. And then at 44, she decided, I'm going to do stand-up comedy. If this feeling of feeling behind is something that you're really struggling with when it comes to your career, I think that you should listen to my episode with Kath Smith. Kath was someone who became a caregiver at the age of 26. So what happened was her boyfriend at the time suffered a traumatic brain injury. And so when she was 26, she basically put her life on pause for the next almost 5 years to take care of him. And it wasn't until she was in her 30s that she basically restarted her life again. And by the way, her and her boyfriend have now broken up. And so she's really starting this like new chapter of her life in her 30s. And the reason why I think her episode is so helpful is because the way that she talks about career is truly unlike anyone I've ever heard before. She talks about like being an intern at 29, because again, that's really when she was restarting her own life. She talks about finishing her undergrad in the health sciences field and realizing that that's not what she wanted to do. So instead, she pursued fitness and she worked at a restaurant because that's what she enjoyed doing at the time. And so I think another big part of reframing this feeling of feeling behind in our minds is why. Why is it that we feel like we need to achieve this thing that's in front of us? You know, I take it back to my example that I gave earlier about my undergrad, where I felt this need, this pressure to get a prestigious consulting job. But when I asked myself, like, why did I feel this? Well, I felt this because that's what everyone else was doing. I didn't feel this because it was actually something that I wanted to do. And listen, it takes a lot of bravery to carve out your own path, to go through life without looking at other people, to not compare yourself to others. That takes a lot of bravery. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a shit ton of self-control. Okay. Because again, comparison it's the thing that we do instinctively to feel some level of certainty in a world that is so, so incredibly uncertain. But I would encourage you, as I'm trying to do myself these days, to ask myself why. Why is it that I want this? What's the real purpose behind it? And if that real purpose isn't good enough, then that's the first step to figuring out what it is that I actually want to achieve. So to finish off this episode, I wanted to shout out a special shout out to quote unquote Sarah. You know who you are if you're listening to this episode. Thank you so much for sending in this submission. I think that the story that you told about your life is one that a lot of us resonate with, a lot of us are going through. And the fact that you shared it means the world to me. And I know that it means the world to my audience. I'm not sure this episode would have existed without you sharing this story, to be honest, because like I said at the beginning, this entire episode was inspired by you. So thank you so much for sharing that story. Again, if anybody's listening who wants to share their story, you can always do it in the Confessions Vault. I will put a link in the episode description below. And as a final reminder, the very last episode of season 1 is going to be posted next week with Janine Ilya. We're going out with a bang because her story truly is incredible. So please, please stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, for the rest of the summer, I'm going to be building season 2. So if you want to see all the behind the scenes of doing it, make sure you follow me. And again, if you ever have any questions or comments or ideas or suggestions for me, you can always comment on whatever platform that you're listening to. I read every single comment that I get. You can also reach out to me over Instagram. I read every single direct message that I get. Or like I said, you can put your story in the confessions vault and tell me what's on your mind. So thank you, my fellow planner, for sticking around, and we will be back with a final episode of season 1 next week.